Death was never a distant concept for King Henry V of England. From an early age, it lingered in his shadow, stalking him through court intrigues, battlefields, and betrayals. He had narrowly escaped it on multiple occasions, sometimes by luck, other times by sheer force of will. So when the young king finally succumbed at the age of just 35, there was an eerie sense of inevitability. And yet, the circumstances of his death were not what one might expect from a warrior king celebrated for his courage and legendary military victories. No sword, no arrow, no assassin ended his life. Instead, death came slowly and painfully through an undignified illness, one so embarrassing that, as the brilliant historian Suaya Edge put it, if you want to write positively about a war hero, if you want to immortalize him, then an illness associated with his anus makes this challenging. Welcome back to Lamey History. Despite Henry V's towering legacy in medieval European history, he hasn't yet been the focus of a deep dive on this channel. And that's surprising, given that he stands as one of the most iconic monarchs of his era. Henry didn't just win battles, he won hearts, alliances, and legitimacy in two kingdoms. Through military genius and political acumen, he accomplished what few had even dared to dream: the unification of the crowns of England and France, at least in principle. On paper, he was not just King of England, but heir to the French throne as well. Had he lived longer, there's every possibility he could have solidified that tenuous claim into a genuine political reality. But instead of beginning our exploration with his triumphs, I believe it's more revealing to start at the very end, with his slow, agonizing decline. Why begin at the end? There are two compelling reasons. First, it offers an unfiltered view of the brutal realities of life in the late Middle Ages, even for someone as powerful as a king. No amount of gold, armor, or royal decree could shield a man from the decay of his own body. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it pulls back the veil on the human being beneath the crown. Henry V was bold, decisive, and incredibly driven, but he was also vulnerable, flesh and blood like the rest of us. And despite his many brushes with death, he never showed much fear of it. In fact, he seemed to regard death as a familiar companion rather than a terrifying specter. That fearlessness defined much of his reign and his rise. Long before he commanded armies in France or became immortalized in Shakespeare's words, Henry experienced the perils of power firsthand. At the end of the 14th century, England was ruled by King Richard II, whose increasingly autocratic and erratic behavior alienated many of his nobles. Among them was Henry's father, Henry Bolingbroke. Richard eventually exiled Bolingbroke in a politically motivated move, stripping him of lands and influence. It was a dangerous time, and it was sheer fortune that Bolingbroke wasn't executed outright. But exile did not extinguish his ambitions. Instead, it lit a fire. Determined to reclaim his rights and challenge Richard's rule, Bolingbroke began plotting his return to England. To deter him, Richard II took a drastic step. He seized Bolingbroke's young son, Henry, and held him as a hostage during a military campaign in Ireland. The message was chillingly clear. If Bolingbroke moved against the king, his son would suffer the consequences. But Bolingbroke was not easily intimidated. He returned to England with an army and quickly gathered support. Richard, isolated and weakened, was ultimately deposed. But young Henry, the hostage, narrowly avoided becoming a casualty of his father's ambition. Richard II, despite being dethroned, had a genuine affection for the boy and refused to harm him. It was an extraordinary moment of mercy in a time when kings rarely showed it. This early episode had a lasting impact on Henry. It planted seeds of mistrust and resentment between him and his father, Henry IV. Though they would later rule together, the bond between them was never particularly strong. In fact, Henry would grow up to admire Richard II more than his own father, a complex and deeply personal sentiment that deserves its own exploration in a future video. What matters here is that this experience marked Henry's first close brush with death. He was a pawn in a deadly game of thrones, a boy whose life hung in the balance of political maneuvering. And it wouldn't be the last time. The second major encounter with death came in 1403 during the rebellion led by Henry, Hotspur, Percy, and a coalition of Welsh insurgents and dissatisfied English nobles. This uprising culminated in the Battle of Shrewsbury, fought near the border of Wales. At the time, Henry was still a young prince, fighting alongside his father to secure the Lancastrian crown. During the heat of battle, an arrow struck him in the face. The injury was severe, nearly blinding him and threatening to kill him outright. Medical care in the early 15th century was rudimentary at best. Removing the arrow required a specially designed surgical tool, and the wound had to be meticulously cleaned and treated for nearly a month. Infection, always a deadly risk, somehow did not take hold. Against the odds, Henry survived, but he bore the scar for the rest of his life. Curiously, none of his portraits show this disfigurement. Instead, they consistently depict him in profile, always favoring the undamaged side of his face, a silent testimony to the trauma he endured. As king, Henry's life continued to be threatened, not just by swords or arrows, but by treachery within his own court. One of the most significant conspiracies against him unfolded shortly after his coronation in 1413. A group of nobles, discontented with the new regime, plotted to assassinate him and replace him with Edmund Mortimer. Mortimer had a legitimate claim to the throne, having once been named heir by Richard II, who had no children. But fate again intervened in Henry's favor. Mortimer, rather than aligning with the conspirators, chose to remain loyal to Henry. Not only was he a close ally, but he also informed the king of the plot, effectively saving his life. The conspirators were quickly arrested and executed. Once more, Henry had danced at the edge of death and lived to tell the tale. By this stage in his life, it seemed almost certain that Henry would die in battle. His very identity was wrapped in armor and forged in war. He had survived arrows, political imprisonment, and assassination plots. He had become a king through hardship and led with an iron will. But fate had reserved a different, more humbling end for him. Not in glory, but in illness. Not at the hands of enemies, but through the slow betrayal of his own body. And it is in that final chapter that we begin to see Henry not as a legend, but as a man who, despite all his power and fame, was ultimately brought low by the same force that claims us all. Henry V, hailed as England's great warrior king, had carved his name into history through a series of brilliant campaigns, most notably at Agincourt, where his leadership became the stuff of legend. For a time, it seemed that nothing could shake his resolve or alter the course of his life. Yet by 1422, a profound shift had begun. He had married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French King Charles VI, in a political union designed to secure peace between the warring crowns of England and France. Their marriage was more than symbolic. It represented the embodiment of the Treaty of Troyes, which declared that Henry and his heirs would inherit the French throne after Charles's death, bypassing the Dauphin, the rightful heir under traditional French succession. In December of 1421, Catherine bore Henry a son, an heir who would theoretically become king of both England and France. But even with a newborn in England, Henry remained fixated on his military ambitions. He left Catherine and the infant behind and returned to France to resume his campaign, determined to subdue the resistance still fiercely led by the Dauphin, who refused to recognize the treaty or the legitimacy of the English claim. The war continued to rage, brutal and unyielding. Henry relied heavily on the alliance with the powerful Burgundians, whose enmity with the Dauphin kept the fragile Anglo-Burgundian partnership alive. In the spring of 1422, Queen Catherine made the journey across the Channel to join her husband in France. Their intention was to present themselves, together, as the united future monarchs of a dual kingdom. Paris, the heart of France, awaited their formal appearance, a grand, carefully staged ceremony that would symbolize peace, power, and dynastic legitimacy. According to tradition, a future king appearing publicly in Paris was expected to provide a feast for the people, a generous offering of meat and drink paid from his own purse, demonstrating not only royal wealth, but a king's connection to his subjects. Henry, ever proud and concerned with image, was eager to make an impression. Yet in a baffling misstep, he failed to fulfill this obligation. No grand feast was held. The hungry crowds of Paris, already suffering from a brutal summer drought, were left to grumble in disappointment. This omission, seemingly minor to outsiders, sparked unrest. At a time when hunger was widespread and hope was fragile, such disregard was not easily forgiven. Rumors began to spread, dark whispers that there were plots to betray Paris to the Dauphin. Whether rooted in truth or not, they reflected a city disillusioned and a kingdom in turmoil. By mid-June, Henry had moved to the small town of Senlis, situated northeast of Paris. There, dire news reached him. The Dauphin had launched a new offensive, targeting the strategic fortress town of Compiègne. Its location was vital. It ensured communication between the English and their Burgundian allies. The commander of the fortress, understanding the gravity of the situation, sent an urgent message. If reinforcements did not arrive by August 12th, he would surrender the town without resistance. This was not cowardice, but a practical convention of medieval warfare, where commanders were permitted to capitulate if left unsupported to avoid needless slaughter. Henry, as always, responded decisively. He vowed to lead the army himself, to march once more at the head of his forces and defend his hard-won dominions. But this time, he would not make it to the battlefield. The summer of 1422 was punishing. France baked under relentless sun, and the land suffered terribly from drought. Fields withered, wells dried up, the earth cracked and split, and in some regions, crops could be pulled from the soil by hand, the ground so brittle it offered no resistance. The countryside, already ravaged by war, now found itself in the grip of famine. Prices soared, and food became scarce. Henry's decision not to feed the people of Paris, seen through the lens of this suffering, was not just a failure of etiquette, it was a political disaster. One chronicle of the time paints a haunting picture of the conditions. It tells of wolves, thin with starvation, venturing from the deep forests, attempting to cross the River Seine in desperate search of food, scavenging from the refuse and waste of human civilization rather than face death. The people of France, and indeed its animals, were starving. While the land and its people suffered, so too did the king. Henry, ever the soldier, continued his work, endlessly traveling, overseeing affairs, and riding for hours beneath the punishing sun, clad in heavy armor and subsisting on salted meat and ale. Drinking water had become a luxury, one reserved only for emergencies. Unsurprisingly, disease began to spread. With so many people weakened, malnourished, and exposed to unsanitary conditions, illness became rampant, especially in cities like Paris. Noble families, aware of the danger, often left the cities during the summer months. But Henry stayed. His duty kept him at the heart of the storm. Then, without warning, the king fell ill. He collapsed, stricken with what his physicians identified as an acute and violent fever. He attempted to rally, to ride again, to resume his leadership, but his body failed him. Again and again, he tried to mount his horse, only to fall. Eventually, he was too weak to walk. He had to be carried by cart to the town of Corbeil, south of Paris. There, his condition worsened. His doctors, uncertain of the illness and afraid that treatment might do more harm than good, hesitated. Realizing he could not continue the campaign, Henry reluctantly delegated command to his brother, John, Duke of Bedford. It was a monumental decision, the first clear sign that the great warrior king understood he was no longer in control of his own fate. As the seriousness of Henry's condition became undeniable, messages were dispatched across the sea. His personal physician, John of Somerset, was summoned from England. It took him 2 weeks to arrive, and during that time, France held its breath. Masses were held, processions marched through the streets, and prayers were offered in every cathedral and chapel across the north of the kingdom. Henry, weakened but resolute, continued to govern as best he could, but it was sheer will keeping him conscious. When his physician finally arrived, the diagnosis was grim. Henry was not merely ill, he was dying. His body, racked by fever, had turned on itself. His organs had been in distress for weeks. He could barely hold down food. His reserves were gone. There was no saving him. Accepting his fate, Henry ordered his final journey. He was transported by ship and carriage to the castle of Vincennes, arriving on the 13th of August. There, confined to bed and barely able to speak, he faced his final days. His most trusted male relatives were summoned to his side. Notably absent was his wife, Queen Catherine, a fact that speaks volumes. Whether Henry did not trust her or believed her too politically inexperienced remains uncertain. But her absence was no accident. When Bedford arrived, he was stunned. His brother's appearance had deteriorated dramatically. The proud king who had once led armies and defied death now lay pale and sunken, his breath shallow, his voice faint. As death approached, Henry made one last appeal. He urged his brothers, his nobles, and his counselors to remain united for the sake of his infant son. The boy was only 9 months old, and he would soon inherit not only the crown of England, but a claim to the throne of France as well. The future of the dual monarchy hung in the balance. Henry gave specific instructions for the government during his son's minority, entrusting Bedford with the responsibility of ensuring those plans were followed to the letter. He was not a man to leave things to chance. And so, the warrior king who had once seemed invincible lay dying, defeated not by sword or politics, but by the frailty of the human body. His final legacy would not be one of battlefields and banners, but of a fragile peace, a child king, and a kingdom left trembling at the edge of uncertainty. On August 31st, 1422, England's warrior king, Henry V, took his final breath. The circumstances surrounding his death have captivated historians and scholars for centuries, and yet the true cause remains shrouded in mystery. The most widely accepted explanation points to dysentery, a common and deadly ailment of the time. Chronicler Thomas Walsingham recorded that acute fever, accompanied by severe diarrhea, ultimately claimed the king's life. This theory is consistent with the symptoms that Henry exhibited in his final days. However, while dysentery may seem like the most plausible cause, some contemporaries suspected a far more sinister force at work. Some believe that Henry had fallen victim to a curse. According to one widely circulated legend, Henry had planned to transfer the remains of Saint Faker from France to England, a plan that would ultimately be the king's undoing. The French, still seething with resentment over their ongoing conflict with England, believed that disturbing the saint's resting place had angered the divine. It was said that Henry, in doing so, had incurred a divine punishment, a curse that would bring about his death. This theory was later embellished by the French, who claimed that a monk had forewarned Henry about the consequences of disturbing the saint's remains, warning that if he went ahead with the plan, he would surely die. As the years passed, the curse theory gained traction and became an essential part of the narrative surrounding Henry's death. Yet this explanation was not the only one circulating at the time. Henry V, like many of his medieval counterparts, was notorious for his brutal and uncompromising rule. His ruthlessness was legendary, and his decisions often left a trail of devastation in his wake. One of his most infamous acts was the execution of all men aged 12 and older in a captured city, a ruthless decree that left no room for mercy. After the Battle of Agincourt, he ordered his archers to slit the throats of French prisoners, further solidifying his reputation as a harsh and unforgiving leader. Despite this, Henry's son, Henry VI, would come to embody a stark contrast to his father's harshness, a story that would unfold in a completely different chapter of English history. But for now, it was Henry V's rule that remained firmly at the forefront of English memory. While some believed that Henry had died as a result of divine retribution, others offered more grounded explanations. In Normandy, it was rumored that the king had succumbed to leprosy, a disease that had long been a source of fear and suspicion in medieval society. In Paris, however, it was believed that smallpox had claimed the king's life. Smallpox was a devastating disease, one that claimed many lives during the period, and its symptoms closely matched those that Henry displayed in his final days. As time progressed, modern historians have proposed additional theories. One suggestion is that Henry may have died from a bacterial infection known as Salmonella typhi, which causes symptoms that mimic those of typhoid fever, a disease that shares a similar name. Another possibility put forward by medical experts is that Henry may have suffered from cancer of the digestive tract, a disease that could explain the sudden and dramatic decline in his health. The truth remains elusive, and the cause of his death continues to be a topic of debate. Yet, the question of how Henry died is not the only mystery surrounding his passing. A more immediate concern arose after his death, the matter of what to do with his body. Henry had made it clear that he wished to be buried in Westminster Abbey, and this was the expectation upon his death. But Henry was far from home when he passed away, and the procedures for royal burials in such circumstances were difficult to carry out. Typically, to slow the decomposition process, the body would be sewn into the skin of an ox and placed in an airtight sarcophagus until a proper burial could be arranged. But since Henry's body was in France, and only the new king could authorize the burial of his predecessor, the situation became more complicated. The new king, however, was just a 9-month-old infant. As such, the task of arranging the burial fell to Bedford, the regent who was tasked with guiding young Henry VI through his early years. In a striking moment of responsibility, Bedford literally guided the young king's hand to sign the necessary papers to allow for the burial arrangements to take place. Meanwhile, Henry's body underwent a gruesome and unsettling procedure. His remains were subjected to a process known as becoming a soup, in which the body was boiled in hot water in an effort to separate the flesh from the bones. The muscles, tendons, and skin were stripped from the body, leaving only the skeleton behind. This process was intended to preserve the bones for transport back to England, where Henry would eventually be laid to rest. The remains of his body, now nothing more than a mass of bone and flesh separated by the boiling process, were left behind in France, while the skeletal remains were transported across the Channel to England. Upon arrival in England, Henry's bones were given a royal burial in Westminster Abbey. His tomb, which once stood as a grand testament to his status as king, remains a site of historical significance. However, much of the original grandeur of the tomb has faded over time. As early as the late 15th century, parts of the tomb were looted. In 1467 and 1479, valuable artifact from the grave disappeared, coinciding with the financial troubles of King Edward IV, who had wrested the throne from Henry's son. The thefts, which seemed to have been motivated by financial necessity, raised suspicions about the integrity of the royal burial site. Later, during the Reformation in 1546, even more treasures were stolen, including the bust that once sat atop the tomb. A replacement bust was later added, but the original magnificence of the tomb had long since vanished. Interestingly, despite the treasures that were looted, Henry's original grave contained items of immense value. Among these were his shield, helmet, and saddle, objects that were symbols of his martial prowess and royal status. Surprisingly, these items were left untouched by the tomb robbers. This has led some to speculate that there were, perhaps, limits to the audacity of the thieves, or that they showed a certain level of respect for the warrior king. Even in death, it seems, Henry V commanded a degree of reverence, whether out of fear or admiration. The story of Henry V's death and the fate of his tomb offers us a glimpse into the turbulent history of medieval England, a tale of valor, brutality, and the passage of time. Though the true cause of his death remains uncertain, and the fate of his tomb remains a topic of intrigue, one thing is clear. The legacy of England's warrior king endures, both in history and in legend. If you found this tale of England's warrior king intriguing, make sure to like and subscribe for more fascinating stories from history. Thank you for watching.